So Lisa, Lynn, and Bill, everyone in the room knows Lisa Sunan, right? Venture Valkyrie, GE Ventures, but doesn't need any introduction. And she's bringing Lynn Shao, and we allow one token man on the panel. It's Bill Ericson from Wildcat Ventures. And they're going to talk about the tender topic of money.
Money. Hey, thanks, Matthew. Nice to see everyone. Of course, we can't really see you because the lights are in our eyes, but it's great to be here at Health 2.0, where I think I've been every year since they started, so it's pretty cool. I'm Lisa Sunan. I run the Healthcare Venture Fund for GE Ventures, and I am here with
Lynn Chao-Keefe, great to meet you from Kleiner Perkins.
And Bill Ericson from Wildcat Venture Partners.
And our job is to talk about investing in Health 2.0 technologies, which some people call digital health, and some people call health IT, and I don't know, it depends on the day, I guess, how we're calling that. What do you guys call it? What is the category that you're investing in that encompasses the stuff that you see here today?
I mean, I guess I've called it digital health.
It seems so lazy at this point.
I know. We can call it, is it tomato, what exactly? But I feel like we're all, talking about the same thing in terms of what we want to achieve and the vision of it all. So
it's a broad enough category so you don't have to define it too tightly. So digital health works.
Nice and meaningless. Perfect. So there's been a lot of talk about this the last year and a lot of writing back and forth. Is digital health dead or alive? Is it a category that's waxing or waning? What's your point of view on that, Bill?
I think it's like every other technology category. It's always... in the early days, during the hype cycle, everybody gets excited, and then it takes a lot longer to take hold than people think, but over the long term, it's a lot bigger than most people expect it to be. Mm-hmm. And I think we're in that second phase of the hype cycle where people have been talking it down a little bit, and I think 10 years from now, it's...
The trough of disillusionment.
Yeah. and I think over the long term, it's going to be transformative.
Okay. Lynn, what's your point of view?
I mean, I like to think of it too. I always say it's, you have to think about the sector dynamics. And if we think about the real money that's gone in, it's really been over the last 4 years where it's been over, $4 billion or so, if you want to say. And,
give or take $1 billion.
Give or take $1 billion. And so, really when you look at any company, for you to have meaningful exits within 4 years, that's probably earlier than what we would think. I think about 7 or so. So I think we have a couple more turns of the cycle here. So we have to look at it's early in the sector. And I think that ultimately and fundamentally, I think of a very, simplistic kind of evolutionary cycle is where we have great entrepreneurs, and if they then get venture invested, and they have to bring value to the healthcare system, and then we're going to have exits, and then we'll go through that cycle again. And I think many of us, after 4 years, the money's gone in, and now we're really building value in the healthcare system. And so we're at various stages of that. And I think in the next 2 to 3 years, we should have a nice cycle of regular hits that come out through M&A or through IPO in that cycle. And so we're all in that critical stage right now of building value to the healthcare system.
I guess, but I think about, I started investing in health IT in 1998, in my prior fund. So that's now almost 20 years ago, right? And we had some great investments. They went through the cycle, they exited, and, and here we are. It's 20 years later, actually, if you think about some of the health IT investments starting up in that time, or even 2000, 2001, when it really got going again. Yeah. And so we're kind of coming up on a while, not just 4 years. No, I think 4 or 5 years ago, we started calling it digital health, and certainly there was an advent of new technologies,
that I
different
think is
technologies.
The difference, right? You have SaaS, you have mobile, things that we weren't contemplating at that point of view. And I think some market dynamics with ACA as well. So it's that perfect storm, I think, of what was happening in healthcare and then also what was happening in technology for this to be, I think, a different time in my mind.
So are you seeing adoption, Bill, at the rate you would have thought for some of the technologies and companies you're investing in here?
Well, certainly for some of the companies we're investing in, but I guess my perspective is this idea of digitization of healthcare. So you've got to do it at the data level, you've got to do it at the software level, and then you've got to do it at the operating level, right? And so all of those technologies have been, healthcare has a series of layers that have to be built. I personally believe I invest in IT too, pure IT. We're 15 to 20 years behind because the complexity of the systems takes longer to shift out. So I don't see, and the cloud is the breakthrough, right? I think, for ease of adoption.
Potentially.
But for healthcare, people started adopting the cloud 10 years after everybody else had, right? So I think my basic view is the healthcare system has more friction, and as a result, you expect adoption to take longer. And you have to be prepared for that as an investor in healthcare. I think the cycles are longer. But we're seeing good, really interesting traction, and we're seeing strategics take a strong interest in the companies we're involved in. So, and that's got to happen in order for the field to move forward.
So what's the trend, not just the buzzword, because there's all those that we're hearing over and over, but what's the trend you're most excited about right now? Either one of you guys.
I think what's really interesting, and it maybe gets to what Bill is saying, is kind of where are we in the cycle, and cycles are taking longer. And one of the things that I've thought long and hard about is, how sophisticated are the strategics and the buyers? And so we find a lot of, and being in Silicon Valley, we find a lot of tech entrepreneurs coming in now into digital health and saying, okay, it takes a year and a half to sell into a provider, maybe that's at best, right? And, likewise for payers, et cetera. And some of them to start to say, instead of trying to sell into them, should I become, a provider 2.0 or a payer 2.0, and taking what I call vertical reimaginations of the space. And so, I think
Can you
this
translate that to English?
Yes, and so in a sense of really, instead of trying to sell software to a provider, should I reimagine primary care, right? So there are a lot of companies, if you think about, some of the value-based providers, if it's like Iora or others, or kind of One Medical or the One Medical 2.0 Forward or others of that case that are really just trying to reimagine what primary care can be. And then we also see that on the payer side, and we were actually, Bill, just talking about a company that was going to sell software and said, okay, you know what, I'm going to reimagine myself and become a provider. But the same for payers as well, and we see that if that's Clover or Bright Health, of course we know Oscar in the individual space. So I think that's what's really interesting, is to see then you become fully integrated, you become one of the players, and then how do you, what I call, dance amongst giants, in terms of, as you get to scale, and how do you compete if it's, United or Humana on the payer side or on the provider side. So it's a very interesting trend, and want to see how it continues to play out.
What's your most exciting thing?
I actually agree with that trend. One of the things I think that you almost have to do in healthcare sometimes is reimagining primary care. Well, primary care, 80% of primary care, obviously not for acute things, you can virtualize. And you can become a provider of some kind and partner with physicians and partner. Right. So I believe that in order to move the ball forward, sometimes you actually have to build a parallel world that then the old world can adopt. And I do see that as a trend, and I see some of these companies getting actually fairly dramatic traction.
Yeah, but I think, so telemedicine's really interesting, because I think so much of it, if it's primary care focused, feels very commodified to me, feels very similar. But when you get into the very specialized telemedicine, whether it's around behavioral or genomics or whatever, it's much more interesting, I think, because it's solving a different problem that isn't solved by 24 other companies, all of which may be interesting or good, but hard to invest when there's so many that do something so similar. I find. I don't know. I think that's one of the challenges I find in this space, is how much copying there is. How many companies we see that do the same thing. And it's hard to listen to and distinguish what they do. This population health company from that one, or what have you. Are you What kind of breakout things that are really different, are you looking for?
I mean, to your point, I think that there are a lot, to your point, in a certain vertical or a certain space, there's, a lot of players that can happen. So but I do think that there are differences in how they're doing the business model, or I call it, zigging to zag. So I always,
a lot of little
I
paradigms.
do. I have
there,
little
don't you?
paradigms, but I think of it as, I've thought of it as sailing, right? So you're at point A, you want to get to point B, and you have to tack and jive, and how you go about that path again, in a land of, 800-pound gorillas, right, it is really interesting. We've seen if it's reimagining a PBM or otherwise, how do you go about that? Do you take that head on, or do you try to kind of zig, meaning try to get patients in a different way, try to create some network effect, and then become, maybe a PBM later or something of that sort. So I think, the team is obviously really important, but then how they think holistically about the space and how well they understand what the pitfalls and landmines might be, and how are they going to create competitive edge to then scale up and be a verticalized player in this example that we're talking about, I think can be very different.
Yeah, I'm really looking for entrepreneurs who are trying to solve a whole problem.
Okay.
And
like what problem? What's your favorite?
So my favorite problem was and will continue to be for the next 10 years, virtualizing simple healthcare.
Okay.
And so an example, I've got a little company that Lynn and I are talking about called Carum Health that is trying to simplify bundled payments using a software platform and make it very simple. And I think we both had, when we first met with the company, one of the challenges is how do you get traction? Well, you've got to get traction on both ends. You've got to get patients, you got to get you got to get employers to sign up for it, and you've got to have engagement through the whole cycle. You've got to solve it from the beginning to the end.
Yep.
So for me, when I meet an entrepreneur, that's the first question I have. I think there are a lot of, if you think of telemedicine, well, telemedicine can solve a very niche problem, which is how do I talk to a doctor today about a little thing? Or it can be virtual care where it's a whole history and the data that comes along with it that makes it much more efficient. So that's what I look at, probably crazily, but I'm in the venture business. I look for entrepreneurs who want to solve the big problem, and then you figure out how to zig and zag along the way, because it's going to be hard in healthcare to do that. But that's what I look for.
So something like 40% of the money coming into digital health investments right now is coming from tech-focused investors, not healthcare investors, right? How is that changing the experience? Oops. Is that you? What makes you, all right, so you're the guy. What makes you want to do that? And what do you bring into the party that the healthcare people can't bring?
Well, so
And
you
just
should
remember
know,
what
so
the healthcare-
for me personally, I've spent way more time in healthcare than I have in tech. So
Okay.
I came from the opposite direction. So I spent most of my first 10 years of venture capital was investing almost entirely in healthcare, specifically around genetics and enabling turning genetics into an information system. And concluded that we really needed to blend IT and healthcare, but you have to have a deep appreciation of both and the friction points and the big differences between them, because IT people see things a certain way sometimes that's an easier way to build a company that would run directly, that would create an antibody response in healthcare that you simply can't have. So. My view is if you're pure IT investing in healthcare, you're probably going to get in trouble if you don't have the right people around you to tell you where the pitfalls are. Similarly, I think if you're not bringing an IT perspective to some of this, you're missing the boat too. So that's my perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that we've actually been both. I mean, from our first fund in 1973 was a healthcare and a digital fund, and so. One of our first investments was Genentech, but then, in subsequent years, of course, on the digital side, looking at Google and Amazon, we've been Nest, we've been investors in that alongside. So we've been this blend, and I agree with you, Bill, in terms of seeing things from both sides is really helpful. And I think from the digital entrepreneur side, starting to talk, really strongly about LTV, CAC, and quite frankly, and we always talk about this in healthcare and how healthcare is changing here, but just really understanding the consumer and the consumer needs, and find that a lot of digital entrepreneurs really just start from that fundamental purpose. Now, how they think about commercialization and how they think of that within the healthcare system, I think that's where then being on the flip side as a healthcare investor, understanding that, a large majority of healthcare is B2B2C. And so how do you merge both of these worlds? I think it's really important to have on a board level. And I think it's really important also to have an operating senior leadership. So I think about one of our companies, Livongo. We have the CTO of Evernote, but then we also also have Glenn Tolman, who's the CEO of Allscripts. And we just hired Andy Page, who used to be the president of 23andMe, but he was also the president of Gilt Group and also was the CFO of StubHub. So
he can't keep a job. Is he?
well, he's too good. Hopefully we keep him for a while. But so you really need both of these, experiences, I think, to build some of these great B2B2C companies. You need that on both ends. You need the enterprise knowledge of cracking the healthcare ecosystem, but then you have to understand how to acquire customers. And how to have them on your platform and engage with them. So it's, healthcare entrepreneurs in my mind and digital health entrepreneurs have a very hard job because you need to do both the B2B and the B2C.
So let's talk about that B2C thing for a minute. When this whole digital health dialogue got going, maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago, so much of it really was focused on direct to consumer,
Yeah.
but, engaging the consumer. The consumer is going to act and do stuff and maybe even spend money out of their own pocket on healthcare. Is it ever going to happen? Is there a B2C market in healthcare for products like this that are here?
I would say, you saw my penchant of where it is.
Do you have a little, phrase for this?
No, I really, where I think about it is that, a lot of healthcare is B2B2C. So you have to access the consumers because consumers are not typically used to paying for healthcare, et cetera, via employers or providers or payers, but then you then have to flip into the mode of acquiring customers. And I think of it almost like a CAC in a sense. So I think that's where I think the majority of these companies, now there are some definite outliers and, hey, with high deductible plans and where that's all going, we are becoming more like consumers.
You mean in insurance tech and stuff like that?
Yep. So I think that, there are those spaces, but I think you're really going to have to deal with both sides of the equation.
I agree with that. I
You're
have
going to
not
be equivocal
invested
also, in
in
other
a
words?
B2C consumer company. I think it's just too hard in healthcare. We look for the virtuous circle of B2B2C, and if you can figure it out as you acquire customers, they stay on your platform, and you can provide other value to them. That is the perfect circle of B2B2C, and it's not just consumer. There are a lot of companies, just healthcare, there are a lot of companies in information technology that are B2B2C companies.
Sure.
And so from that perspective, it's really not that different. It's just that you've got to understand the healthcare domain, and the flywheel just takes longer to spin.
Well, I just, myself, in GE Ventures, we don't invest in direct-to-consumer technologies because we don't sell to consumers. But I just don't think there's a real, with rare exception, and somebody in the room is going to throw a dart at me, I know, but with a rare exception, there are not companies that have done well selling to consumers in healthcare, unless you're talking about true consumer products, like things that are for fitness or,
Supplements.
Q-tips. Supplements, things that are, truly you buy them at CVS. But other than that, especially in the digital health side, it's been really, really tough.
Yeah.
And companies, I know some of the companies you guys have invested in started there, but migrated to more data companies and things like that.
Well, a great example of what you're just saying is a company called Kinsa. I wouldn't say we started with B2C thinking that was going to be the monetization model. And let me step back. It's a platform, and I think of it as a gateway of health with a very simple Trojan horse, which is a digital thermometer that then has a software platform to log in your signs and symptoms. Why that's interesting is because it exactly. A lot of these issues with digital health is, when do we engage with consumers at the right time? When do they remember their products, services, or benefits at the right time? And so in this case, we haven't changed user behavior at all. We've used something and we've basically created a network effect around the digital thermometer. But what's interesting, so we didn't start, I would say, thinking, okay, we are going to make this just B2C. And we did sell it through Apple stores, Amazon, Bye Baby. But we've always thought that a very huge part of this monetization model would be the data that we received. And with the number of sensors that we have now in the US, we're able to track, the flu earlier than the CDC by 2 to 4 weeks. And that has now created where Clorox and other CPG companies have come to us and say, we want to buy your data because now we can understand when flu trends are happening. And so we captured the user sentiment and the actions and not created new use cases for the user, but now we're commercializing it in a B2B way. So it's both halves of these in a lot of ways.
What about one of the things I've been really interested in is finally the sort of uptake in the life sciences, more biotech, pharma sector of digital technologies. I think they finally have come to realize the value of and the potential here. And it's interesting because a lot of it's come really from the business side, migrating over to science, as opposed to how medicine usually starts from science over to the business side. Are you seeing this, integration of digital technologies, digital companies more and more on the pharma and biotech side, or not so much? What do you think about that?
I would say not in a way that is unusual. I would say more like in a normal pace. So meaning I think relative to the rest of the world, I do think healthcare is harder and takes longer and has been slower to adopt a lot of digital technologies going all the way back, right? Mm-hmm. What I see in life sciences and pharma is if you look at the technologies they're adopting, they're not very far behind where the regular enterprise is adopting. In some cases, they're out on the forefront, which I think is actually a fairly dramatic change. Mm-hmm. There are problems, though. So, for example, one of the areas I think we could get a lot more power out of is machine learning, which is getting integrated into everything on the IT side. But because of the way data sets typically in science are constructed, it's very hard to use machine learning. And so, we're losing we're losing some real efficiency and power there that I'd love to see more adoption of rethinking how data is managed, for example, in healthcare. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Lynn? What are you seeing on the biotech side?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I always think about when you come in with a new innovation to strategics, and in this case, life sciences, is what are you doing? Are you enhancing a processes or something that they're doing already, or are you kind of really asking them to reimagine the core? And so, for instance, like if you see, we've had some great successes of digital health companies where I think you're just almost, as Bill's saying, you're just honestly taking their enterprise software stack and you're verticalizing it for life sciences. So I look at companies like Viva, right, which is literally a CRM system. CRM systems have been used in financial services before that. They just created something specifically for life sciences. And so to me, you're not asking the life science companies to reimagine their core being of scientific discovery. What you're doing is you're enhancing their enterprise software stack. It's the same reason that we invested in a company called Zephyr Health on the business intelligence layer. So that's one type of company that I think we should be well along that path. I've also think about extending beyond, the pill and some of these things as we think about, our company, Mango Health, which helps in terms of, adherence and things of that nature. So these are add-ons that I think kind of enhance what they're doing already. And there's other digital health companies that I think are asking them to reimagine the core. And that's everything from scientific discovering and using machine algorithms for, understanding targets, right? So there's been a lot of companies invested in that space. And then if you think about clinical trial, reimagination and some of the companies there, I think those are the ones that, I think for them, it just will take longer for them to then, like when you think of the pipeline, the billions of dollars that go into discovering these therapeutics and then, clinically going out and doing rigorous clinical science around. They just want to make sure in a stepwise fashion that they're making the right bets and they're not putting pipeline at risk, I think.
Well, that's interesting, though, because we have an investment called Evidation, which is sort of reimagining clinical trials. I mean, that's definitely their mission. And, they're really taking the world by storm lately. It took, a little while to take off, but it's really, really taking off. And I think, leveraging the power of digital to build cohorts for trials and studies for both drugs and digital technologies and the combinations thereof. It's very interesting to see that and how, now all of a sudden, 5-year overnight sensation kind of thing, right? The number of big pharmaceutical companies that want to work with them in a very different and interesting kind of way.
But interesting, I mean, if I'm, in the commercialization of Evidation in the earlier days, it was more of some of you in the digital health startups that wanted to validate, their findings through Evidation. And then I think as, again, you get that maturity and trust, then it will start to flip, right, with the larger companies as they really think about, putting their pipelines.
Well, I think that's the reason it's interesting that digital health has come from business to medicine as opposed to from science to medicine.
Yeah.
That focus on evidence and proof has been lacking, frankly, in a lot of the digital health stuff on the clinical side. And now we're starting to see a renaissance there of people recognizing, oh, the FDA probably is a good idea, and the proof of the clinical or other validity of what you're offering is essential to purchase.
Yeah.
So. Valuations, are they going up or going down over the next 6 months? What do you think? 2 minutes left, so use them wisely.
I think they're going in both directions depending on who the investor
for God's
is.
sake.
Yeah.
I mean, look, there is so much capital sitting out there that I don't believe you can say they're going to go down. Do I think they're probably
So smart people are going to send them down, and not so smart people are going to still pay up?
I'm not saying that. I just think there's so much capital. It's a supply-demand problem. I don't know what you think.
Are you going to say the same thing? Oh,
no, I would say, well, it kind of links to your other question, to be quite frank, is that, some of the dollars that are coming in are digital investors. And I think, depending what we're talking about, it always depends on the company and the team and the track record. But sometimes I think some of those benchmarks are transferred from what we see in, let's say, enterprise software or the consumer deals over into digital health.
Yeah.
And so it's created, I would say some high valuations in some of these deals that have, I think, connections to the digital world and potential for digital investors. I think that will continue, though, to be frank.
But to totally eat my words after making fun of you, Bill, I mean, I think, you're right, because I'm seeing there's, the 1% of deals that are super amazing companies with great teams, proof of concept, great market traction, revenue, all that, and they are just getting bid up like crazy and competed for. And the rest, not quite so much, really heading in the other direction. So I think it's an interesting time, sort of the best of the best as opposed to everybody's rising, which I think we were seeing a year ago still. So quick, one sentence. What's your number one digital health prediction for next year? Each one of you.
For next year, I'd like to see more M&A from the larger companies.
Okay.
We'll see that.
It's hard for me to make a single prediction because I think it's an evolutionary business. What I'd really like to see, my biggest prediction is we'll make a lot more progress when the political stuff settles down. When we have a healthcare system, maybe 5, I don't know. But you remember when the ACA came out, everything paused. And I worry a little that we're going to go through a pause period. So my prediction is they'll stop.
Take a 3-year nap and come back with your money. That's
there you go. And let people
first
progress.
First get ahead of HHS. And
Thank you guys very much for your time. Thank you.
All right.